Fullmetal Alchemist.
Before moving past Laboratory 5, it is now a good time to discuss one of my biggest problems with Mangahood, the way danger and conflict are handled, and the plot armor Ed and Al are given. After all, it is at the end of this section of the story that Ed is rescued from the collapsing building by envy and lust. Here we are shown that the primary antagonist will definitely not harm Ed and will in fact save him because he's a sacrifice that's needed for some sort of master plan. The good part of this is that we now know that there is something else going on and we know a little bit more of the specifics of it, even if not too much. It's still got that mystery kept intact. And that this is all leading to something really big that Ed is inherently tied up in. Now, even if he wants to turn his back on his journey or from future conflicts with the homunculi, he can't. The bad part of this is, well, everything else. Because this is one of the worst examples of plot armor that I've ever seen in a work of fiction, and I do not say that lightly. In Mangahood, Ed can now get into any situation, and as long as the situation involves the homunculi, which they pretty much always do, he's not in any real danger. And this isn't just a temporary state of affairs. In fact, this is a state of affairs that extends to Al as well. Because of this, all of Mangahood's conflict loses an enormous amount of weight. Certainly, it is always unlikely for a protagonist to be harmed in any serious way or be killed in a story, but it's still always a possibility in most fantasy series, and at the least, it remains open. But in Mangahood, all of that tension is gone. This is by far one of the worst things Mangahood does conceptually, even if it is in service of a potentially interesting plan. Now, you might be thinking, well, sure, Lowart, but what about 2003? The homunculi need Ed in 2003 too, don't they? And if you were thinking that, then sure, you're kind of right. But it's still not quite the same. In 2003, the nature of their need for Ed is far different. As soon as we learn about the homunculi needing Ed, we know why. Even if it's a bit of a vague idea of why. And we also see now that even if it would be a very hard thing to replace him, it seems like he could be replaced. And we know for a fact that the homunculi do not need Al. So even if it is unlikely that Ed would be harmed given the current state of affairs, Al can still be harmed. Also, after what happened in the 5th laboratory, the homunculi's plans have possibly changed. After all, they lost so much material. Who's to say that they won't start looking at completely different options? That Ed doing something for them is now completely off the table. My overall point here is that 2003 may do something similar, but the way it handles this similar aspect is completely different. And as much as I wish I could stop bitching about Brotherhood, the bitching shall continue a little bit longer. Actually, it could be quite a bit longer. So, a little side note. If you're a fan of Brotherhood and you went into these going, yeah, we'll get to the good part of Brotherhood soon enough, and, it can't take too long, it's gonna be a good time, I'm ready for this, then I'm sorry for how long this is taking. But I promise you that I will be praising Brotherhood. Brotherhood is a wonderful show, and even if I don't think it deserves its frequently granted status of greatest anime of all time, or even if I have a lot of problems with it, I do think that it's a show that is deserving of a lot of the praise it gets, and I will be giving it some praise eventually. So anyway, back to bitching. Following the Laboratory 5 incident, we are immediately treated to yet another instance of how differently 2003 and Brotherhood handle consequences. In 2003, the aftermath of this is handled with a whole lot of seriousness because, well, Ed and Al almost died because they lied to Ross and went against orders. We are shown yet again how headstrong, prideful, and stupid Ed can be. I mean, he tries to apologize for what he did, telling Al that he'll get him back to normal right away, but he also downplays just how dangerous everything in the lab was even after Ross had to put herself in a whole lot of danger to save him. Meanwhile, Brotherhood plays up the comedy, opening with this goofy-looking version of Ed's face, then with a bunch of slapstick-esque humor as Ross and Brosh tell him that one of his best leads yet again has been destroyed. Now, I know that sometimes people prefer the lighthearted tone of Brotherhood, and even if I'm not one of those sorts of people, I understand and respect that point of view. We all have different reasons for watching shows and for consuming fiction. Maybe you want something that doesn't dwell on the negative as much as 2003. That's fine. But I hope that we can agree that something this serious shouldn't be played up comedically, that it should be granted a certain amount of seriousness. Because moments like these actively ruin Ed's characterization. If this is played up as a joke, the audience loses sight of just how serious he is about his quest to get his and Al's bodies back. It makes it feel like he really doesn't care all that much about Al, or that he's the title character in some goofy comedy with a narrative force that finds his suffering humorous, or that he's just emotionally underdeveloped or something, I don't know. The manga is quite a bit better in this regard. Sure, we still get some goofy looking versions of Ed, but there's far less comedy here than there is in Brotherhood. So this is yet another example of Brotherhood injecting an extra dose of comedy into the story that simply isn't present in the source material and isn't necessary. Now, Brotherhood tries to quickly flip from comedic to serious as Ross tells Ed that he can trust in adults more. While I appreciate that Brotherhood is trying to tackle this moment with a certain amount of weight to it, it makes it very self-serious with this sentimental sounding piano in the background. It's a bit much on its own, and it's way too much after this comedic moment. Brotherhood has a lot of problems with flipping from one tone to another, and this is one of the most egregious examples of that yet. Meanwhile, this is an extremely touching moment in 2003, with no music to speak of and with a weight lended to it because Ross's feelings here seem so much more personal and understandable. I know I've said this a ton of times, but I'll say it again. She's been set up as a mother figure for Ed, so having her act this way goes beyond her just wanting Ed to be safe because she's a good person. She wants Ed to be safe because she feels responsible for him, because she's been there for him, because she's risked her life to save him. And instead of having more goofiness when Ed says that he's the one who should be sorry, we instead are shown the slightest smile from Ross, because she's happy that Ed has learned something, and because this seems like a genuine change. The next thing up is Ed's phone call with Winry, which shows us some difference between Ed's relationship with Winry in 2003 and Mangahood. In 2003, Ed is a bit nervous to phone Winry after his arm stops working, but his nervousness is not made the center of attention. Also, as Ed hangs up after an incredibly brief conversation, and after asking her to do something for him, we get just another indication of how much of a brat he is. Meanwhile, Mangahood's Ed is really freaked out by the prospect of phoning up Winry for help, and actually ends the conversation like a proper human being, by saying bye and all that jazz. This is one case where, though the conversation is pretty different in tone and content in each series, I think that it works equally well in both versions, and shows us some of the most major differences between Mangahood's Ed and 2003's Ed. Because although they are characters who share many similarities, they are still very different people. In 2003, this is the point where Hughes comes in and asks Ed what's going on, further solidifying Hughes' place as the greatest of all time and as a father figure to Ed. After all, Ed seems seriously distressed over what happened in the 5th lab, and he still tells Hughes everything that has happened. I know this is yet another thing that I've already said, but the emphasis placed on Hughes is just so much greater than the emphasis placed on him in Mangahood. He really gets to shine in this series, which makes some events that we're drawing ever closer to all the more crushing. And then Winry arrives. Cool little note, both Mangahood and 2003 have this little moment where we can see Izumi moving around or just in the background in general. It doesn't really mean anything, but it is neat that it's included in all versions of Fullmetal Alchemist. Now, while Winry's interaction with Ed in the hospital might, on the surface, seem kind of similar between versions, it is greatly different. In 2003, Winry immediately takes the blame, and Ed immediately tries to comfort her. In Mangahood, but really far more extremely just in Brotherhood, Ed is prompted to apologize because of the watchful eyes of others. Now, I'm not saying that Brotherhood Ed wouldn't have apologized without them there, but in 2003, it really shows some maturity here that he just apologizes, that he genuinely tries to comfort Winry without hesitation. Since Ed growing more mature is of particularly great importance in 2003, this is a very intelligent change to make, even if it is rather small in the grand scheme of things. Now, I don't know if this is just me, or if this is something other people feel as well, but I really hate how quickly Winry changes attitudes in Mangahood, thinking, everything turned out alright. It just feels too cold. I mean, he's not dead, but it's hardly like everything turned out fine. Keep in mind, at this point, from her point of view, she likely believes that this is pretty much all her own fault. All she knows is Ed was in a fight, his arm stopped working, and he ended up in the hospital. Thinking everything turned out alright is just blatantly wrong from her perspective. I only bring this up because generally, Mangahood treats Winry as a character who is sympathetic and cares deeply for Ed and Al. Having her act this way just doesn't feel in line with the rest of her characterization. Again, this is far more extreme in Brotherhood, with the whole change of music and the more drastic change in styles here. In the manga, even if I'm not a big fan of it, I do kind of understand. To me, the manga is just showing how quickly Winry and Ed revert back to their usual selves. How her and Ed aren't going to make a big deal out of much, and they're just going to keep moving forward, like friends often do. So in the manga, it does stand as a testament to the consistency of their relationship, and how difficult it would be for anything to change that. In 2003, she also flips to pretending that she didn't do anything wrong, but she seems to do it more out of nervousness and awkwardness than anything else, which is easier for me to relate to, as she doesn't go on to immediately nag Ed about his milk. I mean, Winry in 2003 still nags Ed about his milk, but there's at least some time between the events. But I still don't like it, because it's related to a stupid fucking short joke. And with that, we finally reached the thing that I expected to reach 2 parts prior to this part of this series. Al's whole identity crisis. Now, Brotherhood fans, beware, because I despise this part of Brotherhood. Because it just doesn't feel natural in Brotherhood. Where did this come from? Some serial killer guy just tells Al that he might be made up and now he's convinced of it? Come on, get out of here. That's silly. But, and don't get me wrong here, that is not to say that it isn't understandable on some sort of level. On an empathetic level, at least. And that way it makes complete sense. Of course Al might feel this way. I imagine that having a body like this would feel horrible. But that's the problem. I imagine. Outside of a couple of times I can recall, Brotherhood has done very little to draw attention to Al's suffering. To be fair, this is not focused on all that much in the manga either, but it does still feel more natural there, as we've had more time with Al, and simply by having more time with him, it's easier to empathize with him. Now, in 2003, this is handled so much better, even if it is far from the best part of Fullmetal Alchemist. So let's consider how Ed and Al's relationship has been built up in 2003, and how this moment in general has been built up to. In the next episode of this video series.